Newsflash from Venice, 1490. A rabbi is asked if cross-dressing on Purim is halachically okay. His answer might shock you. What if I told you that Purim and Mardi Gras have more in common than you think, and that they might change the way we look at celebration and excess? This week, Jews around the world will celebrate Purim. Rather than focus on its storyline and text, we'll focus on the irreverent celebration of this holiday. We'll review Purim within the context of other similar non-Jewish holidays of irreverence, with insights from a seminal book by Harvey Cox, the esteemed Harvard theologian, called Feast of Fools. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube. We also publish a source sheet on Sfaria, and a link is included in the show notes. So, Rabbi, last week you said we should talk about Purim, and here we are. So by the time you're listening to this, you might even have a drink or two. But as I said in the intro, the name of this episode is Feast of Fools, and that is the name of a seminal book by Harvey Cox that we are going to jump into. But Feast of Fools itself, if you look it up in Wikipedia, was something that happened in the Middle Ages in southern France, where participants would elect either a false bishop, a false archbishop, a false pope. They would have ecclesiastical rituals would be parodied, and higher and lower clergy would change places. So a real mayhem, if you will. Of course, Carnival and Mardi Gras we're a little bit more familiar with, which again are around this time, as is St. Patrick's Day and other spring-like holidays where we all feel like bursting out of the constraints of winter. But they all have, I think, something in common and something that might teach us. I mean, in Carnival, they have elaborate costumes and masks that should strike a chord with those who celebrate Purim. Participants indulge in excessive consumption of alcohol and other foods. So really, these indulgences, some are connected to spring, and others, Rabbi, are connected to the other more serious holidays that come to follow. We celebrated last week one of the 4 Shabbatot that comes preceding Passover, if you will. We're all starting to think even beyond Purim when we do Purim. And one of the reasons they say that people would drink a lot of alcohol before Easter and Lent was they knew they couldn't drink during Lent, right. So they drank it up. We do the same thing for chametz. We drink our liquid assets, Rabbi.
That is interesting. You know, it's funny because you said spring, and I said to myself, hey, you need to mention the fact that it's before the serious holidays.
Yes. And if that wasn't enough, I just realized this year that there is an Indian holiday called Holi. I saw an announcement from a Jewish community in Los Gatos, and they are doing a Holi, Holi Purim. And again, what that celebrates, if you look it up in Wikipedia, first of all, the interesting thing, Rabbi, about Holi is it is linked to the full moon, the same full moon that marks the celebration of Purim. And it does have to do with the end of winter and the ideas of colors. They go around spraying each other with colors, and then they go ahead and they have meals. The idea is to reset and renew ruptured relationship, ends conflicts, get rid of all of the accumulation from staying inside of their houses during the winter. So a lot of things, I would say this is one of the situations where our humanity really impacts on our festivals. And you have to be blind even before you get to that rabbi in Venice if you don't say that there are some commonalities here in terms of how we celebrate the onset of spring and the end of winter, but also what what lessons we ought to take from it. And maybe some things have been lost in translation as we moderns have shed a little bit too much of our traditions. So what thinks you, Rabbi, of these spring holidays?
No, I mean, I love it. I love, just like you talk about the winter holidays, that Hanukkah goes with Christmas and Kwanzaa. So here too, you have the spring holidays. And again, and Pesach goes with Easter, but here you have the kind of the preliminary spring holidays, which are fantastic. So this is a great topic.
So I wanted a little bit of license because we are not doing what's typically done if you look at Purim seriously. I'm not even going to go into what Purim Torah is when you look at Purim not seriously. But a lot of it has to do with looking at the story, the text, the fact that God's not mentioned. But I have to say, it is not only the last book in the Jewish canon, it is one that was almost on the fence as to whether it was going to be accepted into Tanakh. There are discussions that talk about whether it should be part of the canon. There are discussions that talk about whether, like a Torah scroll, it renders impure or not impure. There's even a question that normally I think we read in one way, but we can read in another. The Gemara in Chulin says, from where in the Torah do we know Esther? And of course, we all know the answer, Rabbi. V'hastir astir et panai. In Deuteronomy, God talks about hiding his face. So typically they talk about this is how we know everything in the Megillah is hidden. God's name is not there. We hide behind masks. But in another way, you can almost ask, the rabbi is asking, how do we know it's part of the canon?
Right.
How do we know that it's not simply an allegory? There are those who believe, along with maybe the story of Job, that this is too fanciful, it's too Hollywood, it's too entertaining and absolutely immersive. Maybe it's just a story that we have to take lessons from and didn't actually happen. But I think, Rabbi, that gives us a great license to say, let's not talk about the story of Purim. Let's talk a way about how we celebrate it. And it is a unique celebration. So if you look at Esther 9, it says, and so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very end day which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. And the Jews got their enemies in their power. The word for the opposite happened is v'nahapechu. And that is the name of songs that we sing. But what ultimately the takeaway from that is this is a day where we turn everything that we otherwise hold dear on its head. It's opposites. We might dress in women's clothing. We might drink to excess. Everything is v'nahapechu, turned upside down. I think if you had to characterize the way we celebrate the holiday, that clearly would be one token. And the other, of course, is it says that in those days, the Jews were v'nahapich, they were transformed. I like that interpretation, that translation. Yeah. And they were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, mishteh v'simcha, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. So clearly, of all of the holidays, this is the one that we are commanded to be a little foolish, merrymaking, mishteh v'simcha. I mean, I think simcha is something that we come across more regularly in the Torah, but the mishteh part of it emphasizes the eating to excess and maybe drinking.
Yeah, I mean, you have to say that it's related to the story. The story is around parties, so that's the way we celebrate around parties. Now you could say they build parties into the story because they want us to celebrate that way. You don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg.
Absolutely. But here's where I think they take it to the next level. In the Megillah, in the Talmud Megillah, it says, Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he is so intoxicated that he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And I think this is the famous kind of operating motive of the holiday. We're really pushing the envelope. And I think is the fuse or the thing that we have to unravel about this holiday. What were they getting at? What was the meaning? I should say that I always thought intoxicated was pretty straightforward. It says in the Hebrew, libsomei puria. Rashi says libsomei la histaker b'yayin, intoxicated with wine. But if you look at Jastrow, he really seems to be more eating in excess, eating in delicate, more in line with what you were talking about
Right.
of kind of doing. So it's almost gluttony. It's almost, I would say pushing the outside of the envelope. I hadn't
I
realized
would
it.
just say one interesting thing: intoxicated with wine. That's as opposed to scotch. Now, it might be that Rashi didn't know about scotch living in France, but it's interesting. Rashi also interpolates that. He makes that up. The Gemara doesn't say get intoxicated with wine. That's Rashi's interpretation based on where he lived and how he lived.
Okay, and you didn't hear this from me, but I heard that Rashi had a vineyard and was a winemaker.
So it was right. Okay. It was a business decision.
You never know. You never know. But anyway, here's where we get into the issue that I raised earlier. In Deuteronomy, we all know it says in 22, a woman must not put on man's apparel, nor shall a man wear woman's clothing, for whoever does this thing is abhorrent to your God. Rabbi, coarse dressing is not allowed. So the truth is that there are many costumes that you will see if you go to the streets in Israel, of Mea Shearim, anywhere in Israel, actually, people are dressing up. But there are amazing pictures of Hasidic Jews dressed as Santa Claus. You have them dressed as nuns. There's all sorts of, but clearly also literal coarse dressing exists. So the first mention of this is a Rav Yehuda Mintz, response to 17. Rabbi, is there any relation?
There is none, but I'll tell you a funny story. About 15 years ago in my shul, someone asked to speak on the Shabbos before Purim. And he studied this responsa in my honor. He thought that was funny.
But I mean, you can't say for sure that there's no relation.
No, you cannot say for sure. I cannot trace my lineage. I can only trace my lineage to Poland 100 years ago. I have no idea what was happening in 1400s.
Okay, so we have the Teshuva says, the responser says, there is no prohibition involved in dressing up on Purim, even dressing like a woman, since the reason is for simcha and not for the purpose of immorality, to violate Torah law. The Ramah quotes the Pesach in the Shulchan Aruch, and I went ahead and I looked it up in the Shulchan Aruch, and Rabbi, this goes even further. In the Shulchan Aruch it says, the custom of wearing masks on Purim and of cross-dressing is totally permitted because of its innocent and joyful purpose, as is the wearing of shatnez. Now, in the Hebrew, it says shatnez midurabanan. And I don't know why they didn't translate that, but these are biggies, Rabbi. While some would prohibit it, our practice is, as I have already said, so those who playfully rob each other do not violate thou shalt not steal. We literally had on Maimonides a few weeks ago who said you can't rob even as a jest.
As a fun, right.
As a fun thing, here you can. So this is, I think, rather extreme. When I saw shatnez, that really put this into context. Literally on this one day a year, you can do what we saw in Wikipedia about Feast of Fools. You can pretend you're the Pope. You can, right. It's total
There
irreverence.
are no rules.
Absolutely. Now, Moritz Steinbecher, who was in the 19th century, he attributes the development of the minhag to the direct influence of the Roman Carnival. Carnival is a festive season which occurs immediately before the Catholic season of Lent. The Roman Carnival includes a public celebration and a parade combined with elements of a circus, the wearing of masks, and public street partying. People would dress up in masquerade during these festivals and celebrations. Carnival is a festival traditionally held in Roman Catholic and to a lesser extent Eastern Orthodox societies. It originated in Italy and was held in February. So the source that I found this in was the OU, and they said, you should ignore him. This guy was a good rabbi, but he was off here. But what I was fascinated by was he literally said what I said in the beginning, that
Right.
we took what was common practice. And I believe that is extremely fascinating.
Right.
So we're going to talk about somebody who had a great influence on me. Harvey Cox wrote a book called The Secular City. And as I reread it,
We know,
Rabbi,
by the way, we know how old you are because it's been a long time since the book has been $1.45.
that's true. That's true. Now, he wrote it when he was 37, which is hard to believe. It sold 1 million copies. But Rabbi, I think I will put him into the same category as Emil Fackenheim and Yitz Greenberg, where it for the Christians. And basically what he said is God has disappeared and we have to find God, and religion has to find a place, a new place in secular society. And he is brilliant, and that's why he was the most popular professor of religion at Harvard. Interesting thing about him is that he got divorced and he married a professor from Wellesley
Oh, I
College
didn't know
called
that. That's great.
Nina Turmarkin, and she is a devout Jew. And Rabbi, I literally can't believe you haven't heard of the book he wrote after this, because I think you should assign it to every one of your converts. They decided to raise their child as a Jew, and he, being a great theologian, says he better learn about Judaism. And he wrote a book called Common Prayers, where literally he goes through every holiday in the Jewish calendar, every ritual, and comments upon it with love and respect. And if you Google Harvey Cox and Purim, you're going to find a chapter on Purim here, which is not the subject matter of tonight, because he deals with it in a different way. But a book that he wrote that, according to Wikipedia, is actually his most favorite book, that if you see him at a cocktail party and ask him which book he thinks is his most important, it is The Feast of Fools. And we are going to spend the balance of tonight talking about how he characterizes the importance, the significance, and the lessons we can learn from humanity's joint holidays that we've kind of been touching upon. He says there is an unnecessary gap in today's world between the world changers and the life celebrators. There is no reason why those who celebrate life cannot also be committed to fundamental social change, and world changers need not be joyless and ascetic. So that's almost the blurb, Rabbi, but we are going to look at some of his thought, and he's going to take the subject of the frivolity of what we do on Purim and give it a whole new guise for us. Have you read any of Harvey Cox? I know you said I'm dated.
Yeah, the answer is that his first book I have read, but now that I know about the book on the Christian journey through the calendar, that's a real. I actually was just writing an article about that. That's a great topic. I'm gonna read that book.
You have to read the book. It is a beautiful journey through the eyes of a first-class theologian into our traditions. So what he starts by saying is not something that should be so surprising to us Jews. And that is not only associated with Purim, it is associated with Judaism in general. We have Simchat Torah. We talk about Oneg Shabbat. We literally love to celebrate time. We love to celebrate history. And he says only man celebrates. Festivity is a human form of play through which man appropriates an extended area of life, including the past, into his own experience. Fantasy is uniquely human. Rabbi, a hungry lion may dream about a zebra dinner, but only man can mentally invent wholly new ways of living his life as an individual and as a species. If festivity enables man to enlarge his experience by reliving events of the past, fantasy is a form of play that extends the frontiers of the future. I mean, if this doesn't...
That's brilliant.
It's almost in the same category as Heschel's Sabbath. It explains the power of what we as Jews do so much when we
Right.
celebrate our past and when we dream.
We dream of the future. I mean, fantasy means dreaming for the future. It's interesting. That's a human quality. Rabbi Soloveitchik would like that. That empowers a human being. We do something that's only a human quality.
Absolutely. He gets a little Greek or Latin on us. He says, man is homo festivus and homo fantasia. No other creature we know of relives the legends of his forefathers, blows out candles on a birthday cake, or dresses up and pretends he is someone else. He's not taking this lightly. He's taking us on a trip today where he's going to
This is
analyze.
great.
So he talks about the fact that today in our society, and he did write this in the 60s, but I think it is as clear today as it was then, that machines, as we know, can be astonishingly efficient, but there are some things they cannot do. Among other things, they cannot really play, pretend, or prevaricate. I'm going to look that up after the show. They cannot frolic or fantasize. These activities are somehow uniquely human, and if they vanish, man loses essential reminders of his singularity. There's
This,
a lot
by the
of
way, has to
discussion.
do with AI, right?
I
You know,
was-
can AI do these things? Would be an interesting question for him.
I was thinking the same thing, and that makes the celebration of of Purim again that much more essential. So he says, festival occasion has three essential ingredients: conscious excess, interesting, celebrative affirmation, and juxtaposition. By excess, he means that we always overdo it, and we do so on purpose. We live it up. We stay up later, eat and drink more, and spend more money than we ordinarily would. Perhaps we laugh or cry or both. In festivity, it is not superficiality. It recognizes tragedy. Rabbi, he looks at South American religions of Latin Catholicism. He looks at the African American community, and he notices something about the way they celebrate. They celebrate with a lot more intensity than we moderns in his world than we Protestants do. And what he draws as a conclusion is there is no correlation, or I would say there is an absolute negative correlation between people who are no strangers to pain and oppression and their ability to celebrate. We would think, and I have to say, we're here, it's 2 years after the October 7th, and last year we struggled with this, and this year we're struggling with this. How can we celebrate to excess? How can we dress up in costumes and twirl our groggers when there are hostages, when there's such pain? And the point that he makes is if you look at cultures, those cultures that are closer to real tragedy, brutality, chaos, failure, and death, as well as triumph and compassion, they are the ones whose celebrations are deeper. And I thought that was a
That's
fascinating
brilliant.
insight.
I mean, we should think about that for a minute. That's absolutely brilliant that the ones who experience tragedy, those are the people who know how to celebrate better.
I just was just blown away by the timeliness of his comments. He talks about there's another kind of frivolous, however. It is the frivolous of taking oneself and one's effort too seriously. There are scholars who say frivolity of any person capable of trying to solve problems of local interest without the least sense of absurdity is itself absurd. Rabbi, we are living in a time where there are people who are looking at our problems and they're too intense and they don't see the absurdity of us trying to solve other people's problems, let alone our own. What he says is festivity is the way we cool history without fleeing from it. Sometimes we have to step back. And that is what the festivities of a Purim kind of teach us, that we can't take ourselves too seriously and we have to learn how to take the situations around us as less
Well, he's
seriously.
saying it's a reaction to knowing tragedy is to know how to celebrate. That's really fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He says a perspective on history without removing him from the terror and responsibility he bears as a history maker. He talks about celebrating history and stepping back from making history. You can't always try to change the world. Sometimes you have to pull back. And he talks again about a recess from history making. This, for us Jews who keep Shabbat, and we always talk about not talking about the weekday on the Shabbat, he says we need a brief recess from history making, a time where we are not working, planning, or recording, hence the wise custom that outlaws talking politics at business parties. He says it's when we celebrate a holiday like Purim, which has historical antecedents, it's both an affirmation of history making and a temporary respite from it. Festivity reminds us of the link between two levels of our being, the instrumental, calculating side and the expressive, playful side. Festivity periodically restores us to our proper relationship between history and history making. It reminds us that we are fully within history, but that history also is within something else. As my granddaughter would say when she watches Frozen, sometimes we have to just let it go. And letting it go almost in excess gives us perspective and makes us more serious, I think, about
Yeah, I
changing.
mean, it pays to think about that for a second. Why does celebration make you more serious? Because it gives you a balance. Sometimes we're too far to the side of tragedy. We can't appreciate we can't appreciate it kind of from a distance. And celebration restores the balance.
Absolutely. And then he makes it interesting. He quotes some people who have done some sociological studies. Of course, these are dated. I would love to see what the uptick is. And he says they found that Anglo-Saxons daydream less than Jews and Italians, and that Black people daydream more frequently than any other group. If it is true that Black people in America seem to have a richer and more extensive fantasy life than other people do, this could mean that there is a positive correlation between fantasy and what sociologists have sometimes called marginality. Maybe groups and individuals who are cut out of the benefits of a given society are the ones who most often dream about another and sometimes act to bring it about. I just think that each one of these insights is
It's
amazing.
brilliant.
So then he gets to this third point about juxtaposition. And this is kind of interesting. He says, most importantly, it cannot try to smooth over the obvious contradictions in these dimensions of faith and experience, nor attempt to reduce or reconcile them to each other. Rabbi, if you recall, we were studying Emil Fackelheim, and he ended up saying that for the secular world, midrash, Talmudic midrash, is the answer, where things are not resolved, where you have conflicting opinions. And what he's saying is that is part and parcel of celebrating. And I would argue, and by the way, I sent Harvey Cox an email and I said, would you like
did.
to, he's alive. I don't know what shape he's in, but I said, would
He's
you like to talk
96
about,
years old.
would you like to talk about Purim, the feast of fools? And I think this is the best explanation of Vinahapachu, and drinking until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. It is this lesson that we learned from Fackenheim. It's what we learn from the Midrash every time we study it, that there are no resolutions to the human condition. There are differences, and that we have to learn how to live with those differences. And I'll kind of end up by saying, I was in a car this year, a block and away from the Met, waiting for my wife and brother. And there was the Met Gala going on. And the police sent the demonstrators who were demonstrating for free Palestine outside of the Met Gala. And literally, I was there trying to keep away from it. And next thing I know, my car is in the middle of a Red Sea of people screaming at the top of their lungs. And one thing I saw was such hatred, such anger. It's not what we saw in the 60s, where people, and this Cox talks about, is used to imagine what it would be like, that fantasy of the kumbaya, of being able to sing about the beauty of the future. I didn't see that. I saw only hatred. And so what I wish upon all of us, those of us who have gone through 2 terrible years, the people of Gaza, the demonstrators, take a time out, look in terms of fantasy, look in terms of your past, and be able to try to imagine a time where we can not necessarily resolve all the conflicts, but come together and reach out as only Simcha can do for us and joy can do for us, and be a little humble in terms of that we can't solve all the problems, but we have our humanity in question. The winter's over. Isn't it time for us to come out and to sing Kumbaya once in a while?
When you say restore balance, because that's missing in the world, the idea of balance. Everyone is to one of the extremes. We need to restore balance. This is a great topic. Thank you, Jeffrey. Happy Purim to everybody. Enjoy. Now you have some perspective on why we celebrate so hard. So celebrate hard and enjoy your Purim. Purim Sameach, happy Purim.
Purim Sameach, and you have 2 books that you need to read by Harvey Cox. One is Shared Blessings, and the other one is Feast of Fools.
Amazing.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.